On an August morning in 1305, the bustling streets of London, usually alive with the clamor of vendors and the steady clatter of horse hooves on ancient cobblestones, were instead dominated by a far more chilling sound, the low, growing roar of a bloodthirsty, expectant crowd. Thousands converged, drawn by a macabre, inescapable curiosity, their eyes fixed upon a grim, towering wooden construction about to unfold. What would become one of history's most notorious and barbaric public executions. The man they had come to witness die was William Wallace, the legendary Scottish knight, a figure of defiant courage who had dared the impossible, defying the absolute might of the English crown and briefly, miraculously, uniting his countrymen against foreign tyranny. What was about to transpire that day was not merely a punishment for his rebellion, but a meticulously orchestrated theater of ultimate cruelty, designed by King Edward I to utterly obliterate both a man and the very symbol of Scottish defiance he so fiercely represented. Popular imagination, often shaped by romantic tales and heroic Hollywood films, has frequently sanitized Wallace's final moments into something almost noble, a swift, brave death for a hero. But the unflinching, visceral reality was far more sinister, infinitely more brutal, and a horror beyond easy comprehension. King Edward I, a monarch whose very name struck fear across the British Isles, chillingly known as Longshanks for his imposing stature and ruthless will, had not merely crafted Wallace's demise as retribution for his defiance. His intent was far more insidious. It was to be a chilling, unforgettable message, a stark warning etched in blood and memory that would echo through generations. This was destined to be a death so horrific, so profoundly public, and so meticulously documented that it would serve as an undeniable, agonizing deterrent to anyone who dared to even contemplate challenging the absolute authority of the English crown. The method chosen for his execution, reserved only for the gravest of traitors, was the terrifying ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering, a punishment that represented the absolute pinnacle of judicial cruelty in medieval England. This gruesome spectacle wasn't simply about ending a life. It was a systematic, agonizing destruction of every shred of human dignity, the obliteration of hope, and the deliberate creation of a terrifying public exhibition so utterly depraved that it would haunt the collective memory of Scotland, a perpetual scar for centuries to come. To truly grasp the full, visceral horror of Wallace's ultimate fate, we must first immerse ourselves in the brutal world that forged him. Medieval Scotland, in the turbulent late 13th and early 14th centuries, was a land caught in a relentless, bloody tug-of-war between a desperate, yearning independence and a crushing, brutal subjugation under English rule. The ferocious Scottish Wars of Independence had erupted following a contentious succession crisis, and Edward I, a monarch of unparalleled ruthlessness and boundless ambition, seized the opportunity with a predatory glee. He viewed Scotland not as a sovereign nation with its own rights, but as a rebellious English province, ripe for direct, absolute control, a territory needing to be brought firmly to heel. From this brutal chaos, a figure of unexpected defiance emerged: William Wallace. He was not born into nobility or seeking power for himself, but rose as a minor landowner, a man fundamentally driven by profound personal loss and a searing, unyielding national outrage against English occupation. His own family had suffered terribly, had been utterly devastated under the harsh grip of English rule. When he famously, defiantly raised his sword at Stirling Bridge in 1297, he did so with the raw, untamed fury of a man who had lost everything, but also with the clear, unwavering vision of one who could truly see what an independent, free Scotland could become. His astonishing victory there was far more than merely tactical. It was deeply symbolic, shattering the long-held myth of English invincibility and proving unequivocally that their vaunted heavy cavalry could be defeated. It demonstrated, with chilling clarity, that Scottish independence was not merely a romantic dream, but a tangible, achievable possibility, even against overwhelming odds. Edward I, however, was not a king who tolerated defiance. Known for his brutal suppression of Welsh resistance and his infamous expulsion of Jews from England, Longshanks understood that rebellion was like a fire. It could spread uncontrollably if not thoroughly and brutally extinguished. Wallace's audacious success had to be not just reversed, but transformed into the most horrifying cautionary tale imaginable. The English king needed to demonstrate unequivocally that challenging his authority would result in consequences so utterly severe that they would deter future generations from even contemplating resistance. By 1305, the political landscape was crucial to Wallace's grim fate. Most Scottish nobles, exhausted by years of war and fearing annihilation, had reluctantly submitted to Edward's rule, seeing accommodation as the lesser of two evils. Wallace's continued defiant resistance made him not just a formidable enemy of England, but a profound embarrassment to the Scottish aristocracy who had chosen submission. His capture, therefore, became an absolute priority, driven not just by military strategy, but by overwhelming political necessity. His very existence continued to challenge the legitimacy of Scotland's surrender. The relentless hunt for William Wallace lasted for years, consuming vast resources and involving an extensive, shadowy network of spies, informants, and collaborators across Scotland. Edward I placed a substantial bounty on Wallace's head, and the English administration in Scotland worked systematically to isolate him from any potential supporters, slowly tightening the net. Former allies driven by fear, greed, or simply the desperate desire to survive in a world where association with Wallace had become synonymous with certain death, gradually turned against him. The inevitable betrayal came, as it often does in such tragic stories, from within his own circle. In August 1305, Wallace was finally captured near Glasgow, likely through the treachery of Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had submitted to English rule. The exact circumstances of this betrayal remain debated by historians, shrouded in the mists of time. But the brutal outcome was crystal clear. The man who had become the enduring symbol of Scottish resistance, the very embodiment of their fight for freedom, was now firmly in English hands. His capture was celebrated in London as a monumental victory, but for Edward I, it was only the beginning of what he intended to be Wallace's ultimate, most horrifying humiliation. The journey from Scotland to London was, in itself, a calculated form of psychological torture, meticulously designed to break Wallace's spirit before his final punishment. Bound and heavily guarded, he was deliberately paraded through English towns and villages, where frenzied crowds gathered to witness the infamous Scottish rebel. This was psychological warfare, transforming a hero into a grotesque spectacle, a leader into a mere curiosity. By the time he reached London, Wallace had endured weeks of relentless degradation, his body battered, his spirit tested, but his ordeal was far from over. His trial at Westminster Hall on August 23, 1305, was a cynical legal farce orchestrated for English propaganda. Conducted in Latin, a language Wallace likely did not fully understand, he was charged with treason, murder, sacrilege, and arson. The searing irony was blatant. He was tried for treason against a king he never recognized as his sovereign. When given a chance to speak, Wallace defiantly declared he could not be guilty, having never been Edward's subject, sealing his predetermined fate. The trial was theater, providing a flimsy legal veneer for a preordained execution. Judges appointed by Edward intended no mercy. Charges were crafted to justify the severity of his punishment. Treason meant hanging, drawing, and quartering. Additional charges portrayed him as a criminal, not a warrior. The English legal system became a weapon of state terror. His sentence was pronounced with chilling gravity. Wallace was to be drawn through London's streets, hanged by the neck, but not to death, disemboweled while still alive, beheaded, and his body cut into 4 parts. Each element held grim symbolism: drawing for degradation, hanging for heavenly rejection, disemboweling for spiritual corruption, and quartering for complete annihilation. This was not just execution, but obliteration. The morning of August 23, 1305, dawned clear and warm in London. The city had prepared for days. Scaffolds were erected, and vast crowds gathered from across England. Authorities turned Wallace's execution into a grotesque public holiday, complete with vendors selling food and drink, transforming the grim event into a macabre affair. This wasn't just about justice, it was entertainment, a stark reminder of English power. Wallace was first stripped of his clothes, leaving him exposed and vulnerable, and then brutally bound to a hurdle, a crude wooden frame designed to drag him through the cobbled streets of London. The route had been meticulously planned to maximize both the public humiliation and the visceral spectacle. From the Tower of London, where he had been held captive, the agonizing procession moved slowly through the city's busiest, most crowded districts, ensuring that as many people as possible would witness his degradation. The rough cobblestones tore at his flesh as he was dragged mercilessly behind horses, leaving a horrifying, bloody trail that marked his final, agonizing journey. The crowds that lined the streets were a chilling mixture of morbid curiosity seekers, fervent English patriots, and those who simply reveled in witnessing the suffering of others. Medieval executions were always public events, serving both as brutal entertainment and as stark, undeniable reminders of royal power. The spectators jeered, cursed, and threw refuse at Wallace as he passed, their barbaric behavior openly encouraged by the authorities, who wanted to ensure that his final public moments were as humiliating and demoralizing as humanly possible. The procession moved excruciatingly slowly, allowing maximum time for the enormous crowds to gather and for Wallace's suffering to be prolonged for all to witness. Contemporary accounts describe him as remaining conscious throughout this entire degrading ordeal, his eyes fixed on some distant, unseen point, as if seeing beyond the immediate horror of his situation. Whether this was an act of profound defiance, quiet resignation, or simple, overwhelming shock remains unknown. But witnesses notably reported that he never cried out, never begged for mercy, a stoic detail that would later become a foundational part of his enduring legend. At Smithfield, London's traditional execution ground, a specific scaffold awaited. The crowd here was even larger, more boisterous, a carnival atmosphere deliberately cultivated to make his death a celebration of English justice, not martyrdom. The executioner, a grim professional skilled in prolonged suffering, began his work with practiced efficiency. Wallace was first hanged by the neck, but the rope was positioned to ensure agonizing strangulation, rather than a quick death by breaking the neck. The crowd watched as he struggled for breath, his face turning purple, his body convulsing in the universal, terrifying dance of death by asphyxiation. Yet just as consciousness began to mercifully fade, he was cut down, still alive, still agonizingly aware of the unspeakable horrors about to befall him. What followed was the most horrific part of the entire ordeal. While Wallace was still fully conscious, the executioner commenced the process of disemboweling him. Using a sharp knife, he methodically cut open the abdomen and began removing the internal organs one by one. Contemporary accounts describe the victim's screams as unlike anything the witnesses had ever heard, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of human suffering itself. The executioner held up each organ for the morbidly fascinated crowd to see, before throwing it into a blazing fire prepared specifically for this purpose. The symbolism of burning Wallace's entrails while he watched was not accidental. In medieval thought, the bowels were considered the seat of emotion and compassion. By burning them, the executioner was symbolically destroying Wallace's humanity before his very eyes, reducing him to something less than human in the eyes of the crowd. The sickening smell of burning flesh and organs filled the air, adding another layer of grotesque horror to an already nightmarish scene. Through all of this, Wallace astonishingly remained conscious, his eyes open and aware, even as his body was systematically dismantled. Some accounts suggest he continued to speak, though what he said has been lost to history. The executioner's skill lay not just in causing maximum pain, but in keeping the victim alive as long as humanly possible. True death was intended as a final release, not as the culmination of suffering. Finally, mercifully, the executioner moved to complete his grisly work. Wallace's head was severed with a single, precise stroke of a sharp axe, bringing an end to his unimaginable suffering at last. But even in death, the humiliation continued. The head, still dripping blood from the severed neck, was held up high for the crowd to see, a macabre trophy before being set aside for later display. The body was then brutally cut into 4 quarters, each piece held up for the crowd's inspection like cuts of meat in a butcher shop. The disposal of Wallace's remains was as calculated and politically charged as his execution. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it from decay and mounted on a spike on London Bridge, where it would remain for years, a grim, unmistakable warning to anyone who might consider challenging English authority. The 4 quarters of his dismembered body were sent to different Scottish cities, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, where they were displayed publicly as stark, undeniable reminders of the agonizing fate that awaited rebels. This deliberate distribution of Wallace's body parts was far more than mere brutality. It was a potent form of political communication. Each piece served as a chilling message to the local population, a physical reminder of English power and the devastating consequences of resistance. The English understood that symbols could be as powerful as armies, and Wallace's dismembered body became the ultimate symbol of English dominance over Scotland, a physical manifestation of their absolute sovereignty. The immediate aftermath of Wallace's execution was precisely what Edward I had hoped for. The brutal spectacle, he believed, had served its purpose. Scottish resistance seemed to crumble in the face of such an overwhelming demonstration of English power. Many who had supported Wallace either fled the country or swiftly submitted to English rule, calculating that no cause was worth such a horrific, drawn-out death. The execution had seemingly transformed a vibrant symbol of resistance into a grim warning against any future rebellion. However, Edward I, for all his ruthlessness, had profoundly miscalculated the Scottish response to Wallace's martyrdom. Rather than crushing Scottish resistance, the very horror of Wallace's execution actually strengthened it, igniting a new, unquenchable fire of defiance. The extreme brutality of his death, far from deterring, became an immediate rallying cry for those who fiercely refused to accept English domination. Robert the Bruce, who would later become King of Scots, was reportedly deeply moved and spurred to decisive action by the chilling spectacle of Wallace's execution. Seeing in it the true tyrannical face of English rule and understanding that only absolute resistance was possible. The manner of Wallace's death also profoundly influenced the tactics of future Scottish resistance fighters. The lesson was stark and undeniable. Capture by the English meant torture and humiliation beyond imagination. This grim knowledge forged a more desperate and determined form of warfare, where Scottish fighters preferred death in battle to the agonizing prospect of surrender. Wallace's execution, therefore, inadvertently created a brutal culture of no quarter, where mercy was neither expected nor given on either side. The political ramifications extended far beyond Scotland's borders. Other European kingdoms watched the Wallace execution with a mixture of intense interest and profound horror, seeing in it a chilling demonstration of English methods that could easily be applied to them. The sheer brutality of the execution became an indelible part of England's international reputation, contributing to a diplomatic isolation that would later complicate English foreign policy for decades to come. Edward I's message of absolute strength had indeed been received, but so too had the stark message of his unyielding cruelty. The legacy of William Wallace's execution extends far beyond immediate political consequences. In the centuries that followed, his story became a foundational, inspiring myth of Scottish nationalism, galvanizing generations of Scots to resist foreign domination and fight for their freedom. The very brutality of his execution ironically transformed him from a failed rebel into an enduring symbol of martyrdom, more powerful in death than in life. It subtly influenced international law and the evolving concepts of human rights. Later legal scholars would point to Wallace's treatment as the egregious example of judicial cruelty that flagrantly violated fundamental principles of human dignity. The nascent notion that even enemies of the state deserve basic humane treatment began to emerge, partly as a direct reaction to excesses like Wallace's agonizing execution. His cultural impact is immeasurable, seen in the literature, art, and music that emerged in subsequent centuries. From medieval ballads sung by bards to modern films watched globally, his story has been told and retold, each generation finding new meaning and inspiration in his profound sacrifice. The execution scene, in particular, has become a powerful, visceral symbol of the eternal struggle between oppression and freedom, between tyranny and justice. The psychological impact on the Scottish people was profound and lasting. Wallace's execution created a collective trauma, an intrinsic part of Scottish cultural identity, a shared memory of suffering that united the nation in ways that military victory alone could not have achieved. The sheer horror of his death, instead of crushing them, became a perverse source of strength, proving some ideals were worth suffering for, and dignity could be maintained even in ultimate degradation. The execution method, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was itself a chilling statement about the nature of medieval justice and the absolute relationship between ruler and subject. This particular form of execution was reserved exclusively for traitors, those who had violated the sacred bond between king and subject. By applying it to Wallace, Edward I was savagely asserting that all inhabitants of the British Isles were his subjects, whether they acknowledged it or not. The public nature was equally significant. Medieval justice was theater, meticulously designed to reinforce social hierarchies and political relationships through brutal spectacle. Wallace's execution was perhaps the most elaborate and terrifying such performance of its era, involving not just physical destruction, but psychological conditioning of the entire audience. The crowd was not merely witnessing justice, they were compelled to participate in a grim ritual of state power. The terrifying final days of William Wallace force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the exercise of power. The crowds, not born monsters, were ordinary people conditioned to accept, even enjoy, another human being's systematic destruction. Their enthusiasm reveals the chilling capacity for cruelty that exists within any civilized society when it is given official sanction. The execution also demonstrates how quickly the extraordinary can become sickeningly routine. The executioner who dismembered Wallace was a professional, skilled in prolonging suffering. The officials who organized the event were bureaucrats, following established procedures for dealing with traitors. The normalization of such extreme cruelty is perhaps more disturbing than the cruelty itself, subtly suggesting that civilization is always far more fragile than we might believe. The transformation of Wallace from a rebel to an enduring martyr illustrates the unpredictable nature of political symbolism. Edward I intended the execution to demonstrate the utter futility of resistance, but instead, it inadvertently created a powerful symbol of the nobility of sacrifice for principle. The very excess of the execution contributed to its failure as a deterrent. The horror was so complete it became sublime, transcending its immediate purpose to become something far larger. The enduring fascination with Wallace's story speaks to our universal human need for heroes embodying our highest ideals, even in, or perhaps especially in, the face of ultimate suffering. His execution reminds us that greatest victories are sometimes moral, not military, that dignity can be maintained even when everything else is stripped away, and that the human spirit can ultimately triumph even in the moment of the body's complete destruction. The story of William Wallace's execution is, at its heart, a story about the profound price of freedom and the immeasurable cost of principle. In our comfortable modern world, it is easy to forget that the liberties we often take for granted were purchased with the agonizing blood and suffering of those who came before us. Wallace's horrific death serves as a stark, visceral reminder that freedom is never free, and that those who enjoy it must honor such sacrifice. Today, as we face our own complex challenges to freedom and dignity across the globe, Wallace's story remains profoundly relevant. Oppression methods change, but the fundamental struggle between liberty and tyranny continues. His execution reminds us, some principles are worth suffering for, causes worth dying for, and each generation must choose between freedom and security. The blood-soaked cobblestones of medieval London still echo with the silent, powerful message that some things are worth any price, and that the human spirit, even when broken, can still inspire others to carry on the fight for light in the darkest of nights. If this chilling, in-depth tale of William Wallace's horrifying execution and enduring legacy left you unsettled and eager for more historical revelations, please do hit that like button. Share this video with someone who appreciates the darker, more profound truths of the past. And don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Tortures and turn on notifications so you never miss another journey into history's most compelling, terrifying, and illuminating stories. Stay tuned.